you so much, Pam. Great to be here. Lauren and I are going to facilitate three specific topics that, based on your challenges, we thought would be really useful to cover. So as Pam mentioned, I'm Hiam from the Culture Equation, and we specialize in two specific areas, which are culture and leadership. On the culture side, anything from diagnosing your culture through to designing, through to transforming. And then on the leadership side, everything and anything from manager programs to exec coaching and executive team coaching. So for me, I'll be focusing on the first, which is the foundational elements needed to create a thriving culture where high performance feedback just seems to happen by osmosis. What is necessary for that to happen? And then Lauren's going to be focusing in on the toolkit and the watch outs, the pitfalls that we don't want to find ourselves in. But before we get started, we thought it'd be great to see where you're at personally on feedback. So what's your feedback practice like today? And Pam's going to launch a poll in a second where we're asking you, in the last 2 weeks, how have you gone? Have you asked for meaningful feedback or given positive feedback? Or maybe you've given constructive feedback in the last couple of weeks. Or potentially you've received feedback that has improved your performance. We're really curious to hear how things have gone for you in the last 2 weeks with regards to feedback. So we're going to give that a couple of minutes to give you a chance to tick any and all that apply. And then we will show you the results. And this is interesting. So in the last 2 weeks, 40% of you have asked for meaningful feedback. That's a really great indicator. It's a vulnerable moment to ask for feedback. So amazing to hear that 40% of you have gone on and done that. Given positive feedback, that's really high, 76%. Unsurprising, as it's a little bit easier than giving constructive feedback or even asking for feedback. Giving constructive feedback, 60%. Again, that's like a really high number, which is fantastic. And received feedback that has improved my performance, a little bit lower at 32%. And 4% of you have done nothing. So that's interesting as well. Thank you for participating in that. Let's talk about the culture side. So why should we invest in building a culture of feedback? We've seen research recently that shows that investing in the performance management technique side, so just the systems and the tools around that annual performance review time, or it could be twice yearly, or it could even be quarterly for you, investing or over investing in that actually nets you very little results. So whether you're thinking about what's the rating scale we should use, or who should be included, should it be just managers, peers, a selection of managers, or you might be thinking about the technology platform itself. Spending too much time on this does not give you a huge amount of result, either in the employee attitude or business performance side of things. It's much better for you to think about the actual culture side and over-indexing your time on how do we create a culture of feedback. And when you nurture that culture of feedback, you will see stronger financial success. But I think more importantly, what you're going to see is people getting what they're asking for. So 60% of employees want feedback on a daily or weekly basis, and this goes up to 72% for under 30s in the workplace. 69% will actually work harder when they get it, and they will release that beautiful discretionary effort. 80% will be more engaged and then obviously less likely to leave. So 15% less likely to leave. So it's a win-win-win situation when we focus more on the culture side than the processes, tools, and systems, although they are important too. So how can feedback just become a part of your culture and not just a tool? So I'll talk you through 3 core ingredients that you need to focus on, and I'll also talk you through 4 key stages that you'll find yourself going through when it comes to creating a culture of feedback. And then Lauren's going to pick it up with a toolkit and with some pitfalls to avoid. So everything on the left of this sphere circle you'll see is the top 3 ingredients that I'll be going through. And everything on the right are the outcomes you'll see if you focus on those top 3 ingredients. And number 1, I'm sure is not a surprise to a lot of you here. It's psychological safety. It's a big word. It can mean many different things. It can be misused. It can be weaponized. So we're going to go through this in a little bit more detail now in a minute. We'll come back to it. The second ingredient are your beliefs. And that's your reason for being as an organization. Why do you exist? Your purpose, your vision, your mission. It also encompasses the behavioral drivers in your organization, your values, virtues, your leadership principles. And it also encompasses all the rituals that sit behind and reinforce that and the reward mechanism. So there's a lot that goes into that. And I'll give you a sort of a map in a few minutes that will be helpful here. And then the last ingredient is a world-class leadership team. We often think feedback goes one way from managers to employees. However, when you have a world-class leadership team, you will notice that it goes up, down, and across an organization. And you'll also notice that leaders tend to ask for a lot more feedback, and that is really role modeling the vulnerability that it takes to go ahead and do that. So that's what we notice when we see a world-class leadership team in action. But again, that relies on psychological safety being prevalent. And so let's go through what that looks like. According to Timothy R. Clark, who's written this book, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, he sees this as a progressive path versus a sort of a binary. You either have psychological safety or you don't. Starting off with inclusion all the way through to being able to challenge the status quo. So let's go through these 4 stages in more detail. The first stage is inclusion safety. Why it comes first? Well, human beings just have an intrinsic need to belong. This stage really ensures that people feel accepted and included as part of a team, regardless of their identity, regardless of their background. And without inclusion, people just remain on the margins. They're reluctant to contribute or add value. So it's the number 1 stage. Then we go on to learner safety. And so why does this follow inclusion? Well, once you feel accepted, the next need that you have is to learn and grow. And learner safety allows people to ask questions, to experiment and fail without fear of embarrassment or fear of punishment. So it's an inherently, again, vulnerable place to be, and people won't take learning risks unless they feel safe. This is where we often see positive feedback coming into play. Stage 3 is contributor safety. So why is this next? After learning comes the desire to add value. So contributor safety is about feeling confident to apply your skills, your knowledge, your ideas, and make a meaningful impact. And people need to know their contributions are welcome. And then the last stage is challenger safety. This is the highest expression of psychological safety, and it's the ability to challenge that status quo. And it's crucial for innovation. It's crucial for ethical dissent. It's crucial for progress. So without challenger safety, organizations will stagnate. People will just comply. They won't ask questions. And this is very much where you see constructive feedback happening. So that's psychological safety in a nutshell, the 4 stages that you might see yourself going through. And you can go through these and regress at any point in time, dependent on big changes that happen in your organization, which is what I wanted to call out next as a bit of a watch out. I'm sure there are a number of people on this call who would be less than a year in their role. And I'm sure there's a lot of organizations maybe that have experienced layoffs or restructures, or potentially AI is impacting how you work. And all of these things can bring a team back from, say, norming or performing in team development back into storming. And that's something that we're noticing at the culture equation, is people getting stuck in what we call perpetual storming. And it feels super uncomfortable. You will notice that there's a lot of disagreements, that there's a lot of aggressive behavior or sometimes passive aggressive behavior. Sometimes you'll notice cliques or alliances forming. You'll notice very quiet meetings. People don't speak up, or they'll have meetings after the meetings. There'll be a lot of blame, and there might be a lot of over-reliance on policies and process, a lot of CCing on emails. So we're curious here as to where people see themselves in the whole team development stage. We're going to launch another poll. Is your team going through forming, which is actually quite a polite stage where individuals are getting to know each other, but there's still a lot of lack of clarity around the team's purpose and vision and the roles and expectations? Are people going through storming, which I've just described in detail? What about norming? Are you feeling like we're getting on with making good agreements around individual roles and also around behaviors that are expected? Or are you going through performing where things are really humming and you've got this beautiful state of flow happening? You're just kicking goals together and people are operating quite autonomously, but in service of a common goal or vision. So let's see where you're all at. Ooh, this is really even Stevens. A quarter nearly in each one. Norming a lot more, a little bit more, 29%, and performing 21%. So that's very interesting. And so depending on where you are in your stage of team development, you might want to focus on different parts of your culture. And this is a tool that we'll send out to you in our resources. It's our culture canvas. So if you're in, for example, forming, really it makes a lot of sense to focus on psychological safety, values, purpose, and potentially virtues. If you're at the other end, more into norming and performing, maybe you're thinking more about rituals, growth mindset, decision making. How do we make decisions? So it depends where you are, but I feel like it's an important thing, no matter where you are, to make culture and how we're reinforcing our culture and our beliefs an always on discussion. So have a look at this tool, use it in your next offsite, see if there's an area that you can shine a light on. So we've covered psychological safety and we've covered your beliefs, and this is a way to reinforce your beliefs. Next pinch point to look at, as we said earlier, is your leadership team and your managers, because dependent on how they're performing, you're either going to see a performance feedback culture be unleashed or actually be stopped in its tracks. So 70% of employee engagement variance is down to how employees experience their managers. Are they inspiring? Are they coaching? Are they giving feedback on the job? Are they holding people accountable? There is so much being asked of managers in today's multi-generational and multicultural workforce. And unfortunately, a lot of managers are not promoted based on demonstrating these skills. They are promoted because they were great technically in their role, in their IC role, and they were promoted into a manager based off the back of that. So it's up to us to arm them with the skills they need to thrive in a way that's connected back to the culture and reinforces the culture. So these skills should never be standalone as just a training. They should always go back to how does this reinforce our culture? And another thing about these skills is they pair well with one another. So I know a few of you talked about, running workshops like, a feedback conversation workshop in your own organizations. Try to pair it up with like a fine wine. It can always go with something like growth mindset. Feedback and growth mindset go really well together, or potentially again, feedback and psychological safety. Everything should ladder up to your culture and obviously your goals and your strategy. So top 3 ingredients: psychological safety, embedding your beliefs, and building a world-class leadership team. Focus on those 3 areas and you will hit a high performance feedback culture. Next up is our toolkit. So I will introduce the first tip, and then I'm handing over to Lauren for the rest. The first one that I like to use in a lot of our workshops is frameworks. So we do rely on some great frameworks that are out there. And I found a couple really help people create a firm footing on how to give feedback so it is received well. And a lot of you talked about challenges around how to make sure feedback lands well. Sometimes it's not actually the feedback itself that matters. It's about priming the recipients so they are not blindsided, so they're not defensive, so they're not offended, and they don't feel like people are speaking about them behind their backs. So radical candor is one of those tools that if you use it well, it gets you in the right mindset to give feedback. It's all about finding a healthy balance between caring personally and challenging directly. And I find that if you ask yourself 3 specific questions before you go into a feedback conversation, it gets you in that radical candor quadrant. And those 3 questions are, what do I want for me? Clearly articulate what do you want out of this conversation that will be useful for you. What do you want for them? And make sure that this connects to their goals and things you know about them, like their personality preference. And what do I want for the relationship? A lot of people avoid having feedback conversations because they don't want to impact the relationship. So if you can clearly articulate what you want for the relationship, it helps get you in the right mindset. And then the next framework that I like to use is really just one to help you structure the feedback conversation itself. Interestingly, I put a scenario into ChatGPT recently asking for advice on how to structure a feedback conversation. ChatGPT is great to bounce ideas off for this sort of thing. And it gave me back a structure that very much mirrored this particular format. So the first part is the situation. Start with something that anchors your feedback in a specific time and place. Make it your observations, not the team's or somebody else's. Nothing impacts trust quicker than when you hear somebody say, the team feels like, or I've heard from a number of people that XYZ. So this has to be your observations. Describe the behavior without judgment or assumptions. So focus on the behavior, not the person. For example, I've noticed you've turned up later than we agreed for work a few times this week versus you're unreliable and it doesn't feel like you care. Take a minute here to ask for their perspective. So making it a two-way conversation will probably lead them to both acknowledge the behavior and probably acknowledge the impact of that without you having to. So be curious, seek to understand, and make it a two-way conversation. And then don't leave it just at that. Now it's time to make agreements on what we want to see going forward. So you coming ready with some examples of alternate behavior that you'd like to see or they could try, almost like a menu of options. It just makes sense. And then for them to agree on one of those as a new habit going forward. And you can make this extra attractive by linking it back to, again, their goals and adapting the whole conversation to their personality style. That's like going from beginner mode to advanced when it comes to tailoring feedback. And then lastly, just outline the desired impact. Again, linking back to their personal goals if you can.